Isabella was born into the royal family of France late in the 13th century. The actual date of her birth has been disputed but is thought to lie be 1295 to 1296. These dates come from a papal dispensation for her marriage when she was aged 10 in 1305 by Pope Clement V, and she was aged 12 by the time of her marriage in 1308. Her father was King Philip IV of France and her mother Queen Joan I of Navarre, monarchs of France at a time when France was one of the superpowers of Europe. She would be one of 7 children born to her parents, but 3 of her siblings would die in childhood. All 3 of her brothers both would ascend to the throne of France, Louis X, Philip V and Charles IV. All 3 of her brothers both would ascend to the throne of France, Louis X, Philip V and Charles IV. Isabella's marriage to the son of King Edward I of England was purely a political one. Her father, Philip, sought the marriage as a bargaining tool to resolve England's continental claims to French provinces of Anjou, Aquitaine, Gascony, and Normandy. Edward I of England was married to King Philip's sister, Margaret. This would make Isabella's aunt also her stepmother by the time she would marry Edward. Edward had looked at other potential brides for his son, but Isabella's dowry was too great an offer to turn down. Also, at this time Edward I would be looking for other marriages for political advantage for England, but none were found before his death in 1307, and the wedding between Edward and Isabella would go ahead in Boulogne-sur-Mer in northern France on 25 January 1308. Isabella would find life at the English court tough. When she first arrived at the age 12, her new husband was already in a deep relationship with Pierre Gaveston, 1st Earl of Cornwall. She would even be sidelined at the wedding table by Edward in favor of Gaveston, much to disgust of Isabella's relatives attending the wedding ceremony, her uncles Louis, Count of Avaux, and Charles, Count of Valois. It would take the King of France, Philip IV, to intervene, when Isabella raised concerns to her father, for Edward II to treat his new wife with the appropriate respect. The Plantagenet court of Edward II was a difficult one for Isabella to navigate. Whilst Edward favoured Gaveston over his wife, Isabella's father, Philip IV, would fund the barons, led by Thomas of Lancaster, against Edward. Eventually, Edward would be forced to exile Gaveston to Ireland. Once Gaveston was exiled and the Queen's role more secured at court, Isabella's father would stop supporting the barons. Eventually, Gaveston would return from his exile in Ireland and form an alliance with both the King and Queen. Even Thomas II, Earl of Lancaster, would seem to be an ally of Gaveston. During this period Isabella would build her own power base at court, mainly from the French-originated Beaumont family, who were opponents of Lancaster family. In 1311, Isabella and her husband would barely escape with their lives or capture after a failed campaign in Scotland. This failure would lead Edward into the barons at Edward Court, rising up against him. Her husband would also find himself in conflict with not only the Scots but also from his own barons. This would include his own cousin, Thomas II, Earl of Lancaster. The barons' uprising would lead to civil war, and Isabella would support her husband, requesting support from France from her uncles Louis and Charles. In the conflict against the barons, Edward and Isabella were forcefully separated at Tynemouth Priory in Northumberland in northern England. Edward would escape with his life, but his close friend Pierre Gaveston was captured at Scarborough Castle in Yorkshire. Gaveston was executed by men under the orders of Guy de Beauchamp, 10th Earl of Warwick. In 1312 Isabella would give birth to her first child and son with her husband, the future King Edward III. At this time Edward was still supported by Isabella's family at court, but her was also increasingly reliant of the Dispenser family. Hugh Dispenser had joined Edward's inner circle as the monarch was build alliances for revenge of Gaveston's death. Isabella would travel back to Paris in 1313 with her husband to seek further support from her father at the French court. During this visit, Isabella would be injured when there was a fire in her tent. She and Edward would return to England with the support from her family that they needed at the English court. Out of this visit an event occurred which has become known as the Tordenelle affair. Isabella would present embroidered purses to her sister-in-laws at the French court. When she discovered these purses in the possession of Norman knights at the English court, she would inform her father of the affairs her sister-in-laws must have been having. When she discovered these purses in the possession of Norman knights at the English court, she would inform her father of the affairs her sister-in-laws must have been having. Her other sister-in-law, Joan of Burgundy, would be imprisoned for 1 year but later be released. The affair would taint Isabella's reputation at the French court. Edward and Isabella's troubles at court would deepen in 1314 as Edward's English army would be dealt a catastrophic defeat by the Scots at the Battle of Bannockburn. This would lead to the barons, led by Thomas of Lancaster, increasing his power in the English court. Thomas would also turn against Isabella but denying her household any funding. Edward's reign would take another financial blow as well when the country suffered a great famine starting in 1315. For a brief moment there would be joy in Isabella's household when she gave birth to her second son and child John. But this joy would be short-lived when a pretender to the throne would appear in 1316. John Diedras would claim to be the monarch, having been switched with Edward at birth. After John Diedras was executed, Isabella would deepen her alliance with Henry de Beaumont to enable herself to attend council meetings. She would also keep Isabella de Vesey, Henry de Beaumont's sister, as her main advisor. An unproven plot by the Earl of Lancaster would see one of King Robert I of Scotland's generals, Sir James Douglas, attempt to capture Isabella whilst she was staying at York. Her near miss would lead Isabella and her husband to return to France again to seek the assistance of crushing the barons completely. In the meantime, the king would deepen his relationship with Hugh de Despenser the Younger. Events would come to a head in 1321 when the Earl of Lancaster would force Isabella to beg publicly on her knees to Edward, to exile the de Despenser family in the bid to avert a civil war. But Edward would plan for their return at the earliest safe opportunity. This would lead to show how little effect and influence Isabella had at the English court. The tension between Edward, Isabella and the Despensers against the barons would come to a conclusion in 1321. The tension between Edward, Isabella and the Despensers against the barons would come to a conclusion in 1321. The castle at this time was held by the de Badelsmere family, who were part of the group of barons who were opposing the king. The castle at this time was held by the de Badelsmere family, who were part of the group of barons who were opposing the king. This led to scuffle between Isabella's bodyguards and the castle's soldiers. The incident would lead to what is now known as the Dispenser War. Edward's forces in revenge would lay siege to Leeds Castle, which surrendered on the 31st of October 1321. Baroness Badelsmere and her children would be sent to the Tower of London. In January 1322, 13 of Castle's soldiers would be executed by hanging. Now empowered by the victory, Edward would signal for the return of the Dispenser family from their exile. In March 1322, Edward's forces would meet the Earl of Lancaster army at Boroughbridge in northwest Yorkshire. The battle would result in a victory for Edward and the Dispenser, beating the army under the control of the Earl of Lancaster. At the battle, Thomas, the Earl of Lancaster, would be captured and promptly executed. Although Edward's rivals had been vanquished, it didn't stop Isabella's rivalry with the Dispenser family. Free of the control of the barons, Edward and the Dispenser would seek revenge throughout England, confiscating land and either imprisoning or executing people with the remotest connections to the barons who opposed him. Isabella was not exempt from this punishment, as the Dispenser family refused to pay her money she was owed or return estates to her such as Marlborough Castle and Devizes Castle. The actions of Edward and the Dispensers was probably the steering point of where Isabella and Edward would grow apart and separate. there would be more tension for Isabella and Edward created from the fallout of the Battle of Old Byland in October 1422. Isabella would become cut off from her husband at Tynemouth Priory when Edward had to ride south suddenly to raise more men to fight against an approaching Scottish army. Edward wanted to send Dispenser's army to protect Isabella, which she turned down, wishing to be protected by forces more loyal to her. Edward had failed to understand the battlefield, leaving Isabella cut off by an Scottish army by land and a pro-Scottish Flemish navy at sea. Isabella would barely escape with her life after her knights managed to secure a ship and to sail south, avoiding the Flemish navy to land near York. Isabella would lose some squires and 2 ladies in waiting in the battle to escape. Her treatment was fueled with anger against her husband and the Dispenser for abandoning her to move south. Though, Edward would shift the blame onto a friend of Isabella, Lewis de Beaumont, the Bishop of Durham. The actions of Edward had reached the point of no return, and Isabella would separate from him and leave court for a 10-month pilgrimage in England in 1322. When she tried to meet with Edward in 1323, she was removed from court and from granting royal patronage. With tensions building between France and England, Edward and the Dispensers would take decisive action against Isabella. They would confiscate Isabella's land, her French servants would be imprisoned, and her youngest children placed in the care of the Dispenser family. In 1325, Isabella's brother, King Charles IV, would seize Edward's assets in France. The seizure of Edward's lands followed his refusal, as Duke of Aquitaine, to pay homage to the French king, Charles IV. Edward would refuse to travel either through fear of assassination or being deposed whilst out of the country. Pope John XXII would suggest that Isabella should travel to Paris as an ambassador in the attempt to resolve the situation. Isabella would reach Paris in March of 1325 with her eldest son, Prince Edward, who would pay homage to his uncle on his father's behalf. After 6 months, Isabella had still not returned to England, leading to Edward II into requesting that his wife returned home. Isabella refused, believing that the Dispenser family would have her killed as soon as she returned. Charles IV also retorted that as Isabella was her sister, he was happy for her to stay under the protection of the French court. Isabella would start to wear the traditional clothing for a widow from this point, claiming that the Dispenser family had killed her marriage to her husband. She would also refuse to meet with any emissaries that were sent by Edward II to meet her. At this point she would steadily build up her own English court in France, including powerful English barons living in exile. Amongst these barons would be Roger Mortimer, 1st Earl of March, who was rumoured at court to be Isabella's lover. Roger Mortimer had escaped from the imprisonment in the Tower of London following his capture in the Dispenser Wars. Isabella was introduced to Mortimer by her cousin, Joan of Hainault, who would go on to be the in-law of Isabella, when her daughter, Philippa, would marry Isabella's son, Edward. It would be a huge gamble for Isabella and Mortimer to be lovers, especially as Isabella was technically still married to Edward, and with the recollection of Isabella's sister-in-law's death and captivity for adultery some years earlier. Isabella would leave France for Hainault in northern France, with Mortimer and her son in the summer of 1326. There Isabella would meet with William I, Count of Hainault, for the betrothal of her son to the Count's daughter Philippa. Isabella would use the Count's dowry and a loan secured from her brother to raise a mercenary army including Hainault soldiers. On the 22nd September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer would set sail with their army and boards provided by the Count of Hainault. Their plans would be executed in secrecy, as an English emissary at the Hainault court would be detained by the Count to prevent news reaching Edward. After landing at Orwell in England on the 24th September 1326, Isabella, dressed as a widow, would together with Mortimer lead her small force through England heading toward London. En route their army would grow bigger, as levies sent to intercept them would switch sides. Also, forces loyal to Thomas Earl of Norfolk would join Isabella's army. As word spread around the country of Isabella's forcing landing in England, Henry of Lancaster, brother of Thomas of Lancaster executed by the king, would mobilize his forces to move south to join with Isabella. Before Edward and the Dispenser could mobilize any resistance on the 27th of September, the capital had become too volatile, forcing Edward to escape to the city. Isabella and Mortimer would arrive on the 2nd October, where his forces would join up with the army of Henry of Lancaster. By this time Edward had fled to westwards for sanctuary, and Isabella had created an effective opposition to the king's rule. Isabella's forces would reach London on the 7th October 1326. Edward's power had already collapsed in the capital, allowing Isabella to fill the power vacuum. Edward had reached Gloucester by the 9th October 1326. Isabella would pursue Edward in the attempt to cut him off, by she would arrive in Gloucester 1 week after Edward, who had already crossed into Wales. Pausing in her quest to capture her husband, Isabella would lay siege to the city of Bristol between the 18th and 26th of October 1326. Bristol at this time was the base for the Dispenser family. Isabella would capture Bristol and be reunited with her daughters, Eleanor and Joan. She would also capture Hugh Dispenser the Elder at Bristol. In the meantime, Edward and Hugh Dispenser the Younger were attempting to evade Isabella by sailing to the island of Lundy in the Bristol Channel. The attempt of escape would be in vain, as bad weather would force them back to Wales. By this time Isabella's operations would be controlled from Wales, where she tasked Henry of Lancaster to find and capture Edward and Dispenser the Younger. It would take Henry of Lancaster 2 weeks to find Edward. Edward and Hugh Dispenser the Younger would be captured on the 16th November 1326 near the Lantrasant on the island of Anglesey in northwest Wales. Following the capture of King Edward II on the island of Anglesey in November 1326, Isabella and Mortimer began to punish brutally all those who had opposed her. Hugh Dispenser the Elder, whom Isabella had tried to protect from punishment, was brutally executed by the forces of Thomas of Lancaster. Hugh Dispenser the Elder body was hacked to pieces and fed to the dogs. On the 17th November, Edmund Fitzalan was executed. Fitzalan was a staunch follower of Edward II who had received land that was confiscated from Roger Mortimer. Hugh Dispenser the Younger was sentenced to be executed on 24th of November 1326. Dispenser the Younger's sentence was particularly brutal. He was first to be drawn through the streets of Hereford, a town in western England, then stripped, after which biblical verses were written on his body citing his arrogance and corruption. After which he was presented to the Isabella and Mortimer, who condemned him to hang as a thief, then to be castrated. After which he was to be drawn and quartered as a traitor, after which his remains would be sent to different quarters of the Kingdom of England. After dealing with the Dispenser faction, Isabella would show lenience to the remainder of the lesser noble, leaving only the dilemma of what to do with King Edward II. Edward II was initially held prisoner by Henry of Lancaster. In fear of a counter-coup by supporters of Edward, Isabella would seize the Tower of London and Parliament, ensuring that they were controlled by supporters loyal to herself. In January 1327, Isabella would have Edward legally deposed by Parliament and place under house arrest for the remainder of his life. Isabella would then appoint her son king, as Edward III, and appoint herself regent. Even though Isabella had secured a parliament ruling effectively abdicating Edward, these were still volatile times and any such laws could be overturned at any time. Later in 1326, Edward would be moved from his house arrest at Kenilworth Castle in Warwickshire to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, near the Welsh border, under the orders of Isabella and Mortimer. Here he was to put under the custody of Lord Berkeley. On the 23rd of September 1326, Edward II would die due to what was described as a fatal accident. Edward's body would be buried at Gloucester Cathedral and his heart sent to Isabella. Rumours though still persisted that Edward had escaped to Europe from Berkeley Castle and was still alive. Also there would be rumours on how Edward died. Was he assassinated, or did he die due to the stresses caused by captivity? Some of the rumours about die by a red-hot poker were circulated, but there has never been any strong evidence to substantiate this. Isabella would also bring about the conclusion of the war with the Scots under the Treaty of Northampton. Edward III would initially be against the treaty before conceding his claim against any Scottish territory. The main clause of peace would be that Isabella's daughter would be betrothed to David Bruce, heir to the Scottish throne. Isabella would go on to resolve the Gascon situation in France, negotiating a peace treaty where all Gascon land apart from Agenais would be returned to England, for which England was also financially penalised. Isabella's treaties were unpopular in England, and Henry, Earl of Lancaster, would be the first baron to break off support for Isabella and Roger Mortimer and refuse to attend court. In a move to quell any rebellion, Isabella decided to pursue her son, Edward III, claim to the French crown. The French knew that Isabella lacked any financial support for a military campaign against them, which led to her arranging a marriage for one of her sons, John of Eltham, 1st Earl of Cornwall, to one of the daughters of the Castilian noble family, Maria Diaz de Haro, heiress of the Lordship of Biscay. In 1328, as part of her agreement with the Count of Hainaut, her son Edward III would marry Philip of Hainaut. Isabella's taste for power would corrupt her as she continued to build huge wealth for herself to such an extent. She would also claim the dowry due to Philippa on her marriage to Edward. Her corruption would also spread to her lover, Mortimer, who would also go on to accumulate wealth, land and titles at a fast rate. By the end of 1328, Henry, Earl of Lancaster, had mobilized his army against Isabella, Mortimer and Edward III. Isabella, her son, Edward III, and her lover Roger Mortimer were facing a rebellion from one of the most powerful barons, Henry, Earl of Lancaster, at the end 1328, leading the county into civil war. An armoured-clad Isabella would lead her forces against Lancaster, capturing his stronghold in Leicester and Bedford. Edward III and his forces advanced north and captured Henry of Lancaster. Henry's life would be spared, but he would be subject to a large financial penalty. Henry de Beaumont, an old supporter of Isabella who had once supported her, fled to exile in France. Henry de Beaumont, together with Edmund of Kent, would attempt to lead an uprising against Isabella with Isabella de Vesci in order to restore Edward II to the throne, whom they believed was still alive. Isabella and Roger Mortimer would foil this plot, and Edmund of Kent would be executed under orders of the regent. Isabella and Roger Mortimer would foil this plot, and Edmund of Kent would be executed under orders of the regent. Isabella de Vesci would escape any punishment for her part in the rebellion. In the autumn of 1330, safely secured at Nottingham Castle, Mortimer would interrogate a friend of Edward III, William Montague. Montague would report back to Edward that Mortimer had stated that his power was greater than the king's. These words would lead Edward to mount an incursion into Nottingham Castle on the 19th October 1330. Montague would lead 23 men into the keep and would overpower Mortimer's and Isabella's forces with the assistance of Lancastrian troops. Isabella would plead to her son for leniency to be shown to Mortimer. The next month, November 1330, Mortimer would be sentenced to be executed at Tyburn, but Edward III would show leniency by sparing Mortimer from being quartered or disemboweled. Isabella would not be tried for her crimes and was treated as an innocent bystander. Isabella, though, would be held under house arrest. Initially at Berkhamsted Castle, then transferred to Windsor Castle in 1332. She would eventually be placed under arrest at her own castle at Castle Rising in Norfolk. It has been reported that she suffered from a nervous breakdown after Mortimer's death. Her house arrest though would not be miserable, as she would still be provided with a lavish income and would be allowed to go hunting. By 1348 though, at roughly the age of 53, her house arrest was over, as she was able to travel freely through England. In her old age, Isabella would grow closer to her daughter Joan, who had left her unfaithful husband, King David II of Scotland, who was now a prisoner in the Tower of London. Joan would nurse her mother up until her death on 22nd of August 1358 at Hertford Castle. She would be buried at a Franciscan church in Newgate, London, wearing the mantle that she was married in. Her husband, Edward II, Hart, was buried with her in a casket. She would leave the majority of her estate to her favourite grandson, Edward the Black Prince. Although she would leave some personal effects to her daughter, Joan.